But now we've got a ruling that says, the title for all of that land paid for and used by private property owners is being superseded by Aboriginal title. So it means a lot of uncertainty.
What of the land you own? The house you paid for, the property you pay taxes on, the business you built isn't as secure as you thought. Well, a recent court decision in British Columbia is raising serious questions about property rights all across Canada, and every taxpayer needs to be concerned with what is going on. Folks, I'm Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. I am joined with my two friends and colleagues. We've got Devin Drover, who is the CTF's in-house lawyer, and we have Carson Binda, the CTF's BC director, to break down this court decision and really all of the implications from it and what you need to know. Because, folks, this could impact all taxpayers, everyone living here in Canada. And with that, Devin, I'm going to bring you in. Try to simplify this for everyone. Let us know, what is this court case? What decision happened? And what does it all mean?
Absolutely, Franco. So this decision is known as the Cowichin decision, and it's a big deal because it's one of the first times, or is the first time, a Canadian court has said that Aboriginal title still exists on land even if it is private. So what that means is the BC Supreme Court, that's the first level of court in British Columbia, ruled that Cowichan tribes hold Aboriginal title over part of the historic village lands that now sit inside the city of Richmond. Land that includes municipal property that people have been paying for municipal taxes to service, federal land that the federal government has claimed ownership and used, and especially privately owned land paid for by taxpayers, upkept by taxpayers. And this court decision has now essentially said that that land is actually belonged to the Aboriginal tribes, and that the government, or those that parsed up the lands to begin with, didn't have the rights to them at all. And this is where taxpayers should be paying attention. The government basically said that the court basically said that governments gave away land they didn't have the legal authority to give away in the first place when it was first being settled. And this creates a massive constitutional problem. And fixing, where taxpayers should be especially worried, is that fixing these kind of constitutional problems almost always means compensation, which means taxpayers are going to be on the hook for historic government mistakes. And this isn't to say that these modern property owners did anything wrong. People bought land in good faith, relying on the provincial land title system. But now we've got a ruling that says, the title for all of that land paid for and used by private property owners is being superseded by Aboriginal title. So it means a lot of uncertainty. It means a lot of potential claims. It's going to be negotiations. It's going to be compensation packages, most likely. And I think, Carson, you can talk about that in a second in the BC context. And basically, every dollar that government spends reconciling this issue is a dollar taken away from taxpayers today. And for local property owners, on top of that, it's going to be stressful because their legal title, the documents that they hold that say they are, the owners of this of the property that they've been paying taxes on, the value of those properties are going to be impacted with that massive constitutional cloud hanging above it. This can affect development. It's going to impact finances. It's going to impact land value because nobody yet knows what's going to happen after this case. So, bottom line here, government created this mess, generations ago, essentially. And now taxpayers and innocent property owners are going to be on the hook and left dealing with the consequences.
Okay, Carson, I'm going to get to you in a second, but Devin, I just want to stick with you. I appreciate you're the lawyer, right? So but for us laymen like me, I'm not a lawyer. So I just want to understand a little bit better. And I've been reading up on it, but I'm still a little fuzzy. So now I know there's a lot of uncertainty because, this still has to have more legal, it's still going to have more court hearings and all that. But where we stand, if you're an owner of a home in British Columbia, where this is under dispute, or you're an owner of a business, are your property rights to that home or business now just up in the air? What's going on? What does it mean for those people?
Yeah, it's absolutely up in the air. So this case, by the way, which was one of the longest trials, if not the longest trial in Canadian history. It took a lot of court time and a lot of time to get this decision. It still doesn't answer a lot of the questions. What we do have a decision on that There's an Aboriginal interest in this land that's privately owned. But if you own that land now, it's going to create a lot of consequences for you because you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
There's still ongoing court challenges related to this. There's an appeal that I'll talk about in a bit. There's a lot still going on here. And, at the same time, people on the ground are starting to struggle because they have to are basically left with having to deal with the consequences of this, which, it seems too early to tell. We're still going to have other court fights to figure out exactly what happens to this land. But at the outset, it's causing a lot of confusion, and confusion is costly.
Okay, Carson, I'm going to bring you in here because I would imagine a lot of these folks in British Columbia, they paid for their home, they saved up for years and years to be able to, afford their home and pay for it. Or if you're a business owner, right, you work your tail off saving money trying to get your neighbors employed. Now, are they worried that they might lose their essentially the right to their private property? Like you're in BC, like what are you hearing from people?
Oh, Franco, folks are panicking. Folks are absolutely worried and irate about this decision from the BC Supreme Court because it threw their private property ownership up into question. Look, if you're a business, you need to know that you own the land you're doing business on. If you're a farmer, there's a few farms in this Cowichan claims area. You need to know and have certainty that that investment, that land, belongs to you this season, next season, and into the future. And the same is true for homeowners, right? There's a whole lot of families in this Cowichan area in Richmond that saved up for decades to scrape together enough for a down payment big enough to afford a home in one of these nice neighborhoods in Richmond that's now subject to this court decision that's throwing it all up in the air with question marks. And look, Franco, we're talking about abstract things here, uncertainty, question marks, but there's real tangible results that we're already seeing. There have been several big multi-million dollar investments that have been pulled
Hmm.
by businesses from Richmond because of this uncertainty. And it's not me saying that. The businesses are explicitly citing the uncertainty from the Cowichan decision as the reason why they're pulling these investments. We've also heard in the media and from folks we know that mortgage brokers are sounding the alarm over this. Look, when you take money from the bank, when you borrow money from the bank for your home in a mortgage, the bank needs to be certain that that money's not going to evaporate. Well, there's a whole lot of uncertainty right now, which is causing mortgage lenders and banks to shrug their shoulders and say they might not be able to renew mortgages for folks in that land.
Hmm.
That's a huge issue in and of itself. But there's also an important taxpayer angle here,
Yeah, let me
Frank.
get into that in a second, Carson. Let me just cut you off just because like you're saying a lot of stuff, you're giving people a lot of information. So, I mean, like first of all, when I hear this, I just think of like an absolute I mean, really it's crushing to people who, own their own private property. You're talking about some of the issues with mortgage renewals, right? Like that is just such a nightmare for those people. You bring up a good point about the economic damage, right?
Mhm.
Because like now businesses aren't sure if they want to invest in this community, right? So like those are an economic issue. We got a huge private property issue, and also just like personal finances if you're one of those homeowners, even small business owner. But yeah, Carson, now let's get into the taxpayer angle. Like, where is the direct hit to taxpayers from this decision?
Yeah, so because of all this uncertainty, the lenders saying that they're not sure if they're going to keep mortgaging properties and offering loans in this part of Richmond. Well, David Eby has rolled out a big $150 million loan backstop
Mm.
for homeowners and businesses in Richmond. That means that taxpayers in BC are effectively backstopping and bankrolling the consequences of the Cowichan decision. But Franco, that $150 million sounds like a whole heck of a lot of money, and it is for tapped out BC taxpayers, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what this land is actually worth. According to the Vancouver Sun, the total land value captured in this Cowichan decision is about $2 billion. So the 150 million that David Eby has promised so far could just be a drop in the bucket once this entire decision and the uncertainty around it really unravels.
Okay, so bear with me here, folks. I'm trying to get my head around this just like everyone else. So Carson, you said EB is putting taxpayers on the hook for what? Do you say $150 million backstopping some of the properties? Is that what you
That's
said?
right.
But then
That's
the
right.
whole
For businesses
value,
and homeowners.
but then the whole value of the Cowichan area has been assessed at about 2 billion. Is that what you said?
That's right. According to media reports, about $2 billion.
Okay, and like that's just one community,
Yeah.
right? Now you see where I'm going with this, right? So, Devin, let me bring you back in because I said off the hop, like this isn't just for people in one community in British Columbia that need to be concerned about this. Devin, explain to us why really it's all Canadians who need to be worried and need to know what is going on in British Columbia in this court decision.
Yeah, so this case, is not just about one patch of land out in Richmond, British Columbia anymore. Like we're already starting to see the consequences because new title claims are being filed every month now across Canada. We're seeing it in Quebec, we're seeing it in Atlantic Canada, where it's going to show up everywhere. Where they're going to try to have the same result, which basically could upend private property ownership as we know it for Canadians right across this country. And, the interaction between Aboriginal title and modern land ownership and the financial consequences that flow from that are all going to be, it's going to be a top issue now and in the future until we see, some kind of solution here.
Okay, so
Well,
Devin, I'm okay. Oh, Carson, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, let me jump in. And we're not talking in hypotheticals here.
Yeah.
These are cases that are actively being brought right now. The entire city of Kamloops in British Columbia, right now in court, subject to one of these land claims issues. You've got a massive swath of Quebec, a huge portion of Quebec, that right now in court, subject to a very similar kind of land claim by a local First Nations community. Same thing in Atlantic Canada. Folks, this is not hypothetical. This is actively happening and being fought in court as we speak. And this is important. The judge in the Cowichan decision explicitly said that this was a precedent-setting decision. Devin, can you talk about what that means for these cases across Canada?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple issues here. So this is precedent setting, and what precedent is in the legal sense is that, if a judge rules on an issue in case A, there is some, we share common law in this country where we expect if a similar court challenge is brought, in another court or the same court, that they're going to follow the decision of the previous court cases. So that's kind of how we see it. However, there is an important caveat here, which is the decision is being appealed. So that means it's getting taken out of that first level of court at the British Columbia Superior Court and is going to the Court of Appeal. So this is the highest level court in British Columbia, where they'll basically have to make a decision on whether or not the first judge was right and whether or not the precedent is actually being set. So the next step is the appeal, and that's going to be huge because of this precedent setting, basically mechanism that's in place. But that's also why the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is stepping into this court fight. So we will be applying to intervene at the appeal level to make sure taxpayers, like those listening, have a voice in the courtroom because governments won't be arguing a taxpayer side. I think we can trust that they never do. I think, if you're asking yourself, as a taxpayer, who do you want representing you in court? Mark Carney's federal government, David Eby's new Democratic government, or our hardworking lawyers like myself here at the CTF? Who's going to argue the taxpayer case? We're going to argue it, and that's why we're filing to intervene in this court case. We can't rely on the governments to fight for taxpayers. I think we've seen that time and time again. And as Carson, has talked to, has met, has read countless emails from in British Columbia, it's already impacting people there. So, having a different result at the Court of Appeal that clarifies some of this and makes it a little better for taxpayers is something that we're very important, or something that's very important to me and very important to our organization and why we're applying to intervene.
Well, I love that we're getting in this court fight. I love that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is going to get into it. And thank you, everyone who are watching, listening. Like, we couldn't do this. We couldn't have a smart guy like Devin fighting for taxpayers in courts without your support. So really want to thank everyone who's watching, who's supporting the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Carson, I want to talk one more thing politically here. We talked about the legal situation. We talked about the economic, the taxpayer situation. Devin just dropped this great news about us intervening. But I want to talk about the political situation. Like,
Yeah.
what are the different politicians, both provincially in British Columbia or even federally? What are they saying? Or are they taking any like hard line? Anyone standing up for taxpayers here?
So, Franco, let me just start off by saying this is the single biggest lightning rod in BC politics right now. This is the issue that folks are watching, especially taxpayers. And so, of course, the politicians are all weighing in. On one hand, you've got David Eby and sort of the ruling NDP who suddenly woke up after the Cowichan ruling came out and said, hold on here. Property rights are a red line that we're not willing to cross. But Franco, the issue is they've been opening the door to these legal challenges since they came to power. I mean, they've been allowing courts to make these kinds of decisions instead of negotiating with First Nations communities in a way that represents and respects taxpayers' rights to own things like their homes. So that's what we've been hearing from the NDP government here in BC. On the other hand, well, the Conservative Party, which is the official opposition here in British Columbia, they're in the midst of a leadership change right now. So we've got a whole bunch of candidates running for the BC Conservatives, auditioning to be their next leader and potentially the next Premier of British Columbia. Now, I want to draw attention to one candidate from that pack, a woman named Caroline Elliott, who's been very, very, very vocal about the Cowichan decision and land rights usage here in BC. She's been very hawkish in saying British Columbians need to stand up against these kinds of activist judges and really protect not just our private property, but our parks and stuff as well. So let's pay attention to the BC Conservative leadership race as more candidates have an opinion on this issue, because this is going to be a make or break in the next election.
All right, two more questions. Devin, let's go with you. Last question about the legal stuff. So you said we're intervening, right? The CTF is intervening. Just what are the stages there? I don't know if you know this off, but like, when's the next court case? When it like give us a timeline and like how also this gets resolved. Will it then have to go to the Supreme Court? Like what happens here? What's next?
Yeah, so there's a few things there. So one, it's interesting. So, a decision comes out of a court and then they choose to appeal it. One of the parties choose to appeal this. Actually, every party that was involved in this chose to appeal it. So we had, some of the bands themselves are appealing the decision because they dislike parts of it. You have the provincial government, the federal government, everybody's appealing this. Everybody has issues with the decision. What that means, though, is it makes things a little more complicated as they have to kind of consolidate these matters, figure out when filing deadlines are going to be. So we're actively waiting for the filing deadline to have our application to intervene be heard, and I will be updating people on this. And there is always the risk that this could go to the Supreme Court of Canada after this decision is made. I think it's very likely this is an issue that the Supreme Court of Canada would want to hear and put their stamp on. But this is I guess the uncomfortable truth about these kind of issues, and Carson kind of hit on this. This is the kind of issue that shouldn't ultimately be decided by, unelected judges and lawyers parsing through 100-plus-year-old laws and documents in some cases. Courts can interpret the Constitution, for example, but they can't, or they shouldn't, at least, depending on your philosophy, fix the gaps within it. And, Canada's constitution has a glaring hole here. It protects a lot of things, a lot of rights that we hold very valuable, our freedom of expression, the ability for Franco to get on with all of the good nonsense that he does. But it doesn't explicitly protect private property, and that's an issue. So when we have courts trying to reconcile Indigenous title, Indigenous rights, Crown authority, private ownership, it's creating a lot of confusion here that ultimately needs a different solution. And I think, one that's about clarity, fairness, and I think that's actually opening up the Constitution and choosing to amend it to bring in private property rights so that there's, our provinces, all provinces are having a part of this discussion. Politicians across Canada are having part of this discussion. Canadians are having a part of this discussion, so that we can find a better way to balance it rather than leave it up to unelected judges and lawyers, and many of those people I call my friends, but ultimately the folks that should be deciding what's best for Canadians is Canadians.
All right. So what's your solution? Enshrine some property rights in the Constitution? Is that what I'm hearing?
Ding, ding,
Absolutely.
ding.
Okay, well, hey, folks, let's leave it there. Look, there's going to be a lot more going on with this court challenge, court situation, whatever you want to call it. Devin and Carson, they were great breaking it down for all of us. And really, like, every Canadian needs to know what's going on here. I think this is going to be an absolute, it's really going to affect, every Canadian, regardless of what your province you're on. Devin, Carson, thanks so much for coming on the show today. And folks, stay up to date with all the taxpayer news going on and head over to taxpayer.com.